Welcome to the fifth presentation in the series, The Logic of Christianity. In the previous presentation, we looked at Jesus himself and came to the conclusion that he was either who he claimed to be, or he must have been totally mad, or perhaps delusional, or at worst thoroughly evil. You see, Jesus simply couldn't be, he cannot be reduced to a good teacher, because a good teacher could and would never have made the claims that he did about himself. He did not found a religion. That was not his stated intention. We'll pick it up later, but he came to bring in the kingdom of God, something very different. He was not just a prophet. No prophet could have said or done what Jesus said and did. He was a prophet, but a way beyond a prophet. He cannot be reduced to a prophet. And he certainly was not naive, whatever else he was. People have come up with all sorts of theories about who Jesus is, but they don't fit the evidence. And in this series we've gone back and suggested again and again, we must look at the evidence. And I'm suggesting that the insights that come from Jesus, they fit the observed evidence best, and they make the greatest sense of ourselves, yourself, in the world in which we live. And I invite you to come with me and follow this and see if it makes sense to you. Let's look at the Christian perspective on Jesus. The picture that's built up is that God made a good world, but something has gone wrong. God came and entered the human arena, God, the mighty God who made the entire universe, and he limited himself within a human being, Jesus. If you like, God landed on enemy-occupied territory. Things had gone wrong. He came to put them right, and he came in the life of Jesus. Some people may have expected that to happen. God could easily have come with overwhelming force and just sorted things out and fixed it once and for all. But that poses a problem. Because if he had done that, it undermines and indeed destroys the very nature of you and me. We were created with the power of free will. And if God just comes in overwhelming force to put things right, our free will's gone. God has destroyed his very creation. So what God did was he entered our humanity in the vulnerability of an infant child. That takes a bit of pondering. Yes, he did teach us what life should be like, but even more important, he showed us what life should be like. He lived it out in front of us. But in the end, he came to do that. That's the focus of this presentation. He confronted the fundamental evil in the world to defeat it and to start a process of the world being returned to what it was intended to be. There's a lot of rubbish talked about the Gospels and about the New Testament. And one of the strands is that there are many, many Gospels, so why do we only have 4? Were these 4 not just picked because they suited what people wanted? Anyway, are they reliable? And we established in the last presentation that these are the only 4 which are first-hand accounts. That's why these were chosen. All the other later Gospels, the life stories of Jesus, were written long after his life and death by people who'd never seen it. They didn't have first-hand experience, and they didn't have access to the people with first-hand experience. If these 4 accounts had not been reliable, they could easily have been corrected because people were still alive who had seen it all. And that's what rigorous scholarship has shown. There are many, many references in these four gospel accounts to things, events, situations, people, timings, and they've been checked with secular history and archaeology. The accounts, they fit, they're right. That gives us confidence that they got it right. There's a logic to this that fits the evidence. They're not identical because they were written almost like letters for different audiences from different backgrounds, so different material has been selected and looked at from different perspectives. If the New Testament was a fabricated document, which is a common view in the Islamic world, then the whole thing would have been made absolutely rock solid, identical. It's not. Look at the evidence. There's a logic to it, and it makes sense. I want to move on to this word faith. It is so misunderstood in our modern Western cultures today. It's portrayed as blind belief. Switch your brain off and believe things that could not possibly be true. And it's called faith. People have said, oh, but my faith won't allow me to. And it's just blind belief, irrationality. And those who criticize religions, and Christianity particularly, their criticisms are justified. Far too much blind belief and irrationality. God made us with brains and minds. Don't suspend it. Come with me. Look at the logic. And then we've got this word belief. Or as someone said once to me, but we believe that, and then came up with something that contradicted all the evidence. Is that belief? What's it all about? These are religious words, but they have problems. Let me take you back to the 19th century, Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll. Alice meets Humpty Dumpty, and he says, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. There is a fashion today where people use words to mean what they want them to mean, and it leaves the listener utterly confused if they see the word a different way. Let's see if we can get these words faith and belief and see if we can untangle what they really mean. Someone may say that. That's what they mean. Or perhaps that's what they mean. Maybe that's in their minds. That's also possible. You see, the word believe has multiple meanings, and we can use the word in whatever way we want, and it causes utter confusion. Let's go back and remind ourselves that in this world, certainty is not a helpful idea. Everything is a balance of probabilities. Indeed, you look at this universe, and so much of it is built on the fixed mathematical laws of probability. So we're looking for evidence. We're back to this word. Not certainty, not proof, evidence. And there is no place for blind faith or believing things where all the evidence contradicts it. That's the height of stupidity, irrationality. And religions are rightly accused by those outside religions for that foolish way of thinking. And religions are full of it. Now let's look at the New Testament, or look at the Bible. Now the Bible as a whole was written in two languages, Hebrew and Greek. It's been translated into all sorts of languages, including English. But what do the original words that are translated, faith or belief, what did they mean in the original languages? How were they being used? And in some ways it's confusing, but actually it makes it very simple. Because in Hebrew it's one word group. And it can be translated faith, faithfulness, belief, depending what part of speech it is. And it's the same in the Greek. It's one word group. They don't have two roots like we've got, the faith root and the believe root. The problem is we don't have in English a verb from faith. You can't to faith. There is to believe and a belief, the noun and the verb in the English. But it's all one word group in each of the languages. Now, what does that word group mean? It's not intellectual. That's not the idea. We have reduced religion very often to believe ABC, sign here, you're in. The ABC of the Christian faith. Or in the Islamic world, the statement, there is one God and Allah is his prophet. Two beliefs, which are essentially intellectual. You accept them or you don't accept them. That's not what the word faith, faithfulness, believe, that word group in either language could ever mean or was ever used that way. The word group relates to action, not an intellectual acceptance. And the best way I can see it is to use the word response. We look at the evidence and we respond, which is why I've started so strongly with the word evidence. It's consistent with the biblical way of looking at things, quite apart from being consistent with the logical and scientific ways of the Western world. It's a word of response. We look at the evidence. We look at the evidence about God, what he's done, what he says. We look at the evidence about Jesus, what he came to do, who he was, and we respond. Now, it does involve the intellect, and it mustn't be anti-intellectual, it mustn't be irrational, but it's a word of response, a word of action, it's a word of doing. Now, that's what the original words mean. That's the sense in which they were always used. And that's why, in fact, the word faith can often be translated faithfulness. And in fact, in the Old Testament, it's probably better translated as faithfulness much of the time. Because it's an ongoing response, not a one-off. An attitude of mind that leaves us to do things. Now let's just keep that in mind as we move forward. There are two fundamental principles. If we accept that God made human beings, by whatever mechanism he chose to do it, he gave us minds, he made us cognitive beings with consciences. The logic of that is that we're not expected to take action on things without evidence. There is no place for blind faith. There is no place for the people who say, but my faith won't let me, and then they come up with things that are completely irrational. And by irrational I mean they contradict the evidence. Now, religions are full of that, and I'm asking you to look. Whatever your religious stance may or may not be, look at the things that go around under the religious label and ask, what's the evidence? God asked us in biblical language that we worship him with our minds. That's the first principle. There's the second one. If we accept that God made the universe, then our greatest task, your greatest task, is to find out how he wants you to live. He made it with a purpose. What's the purpose, and what's the purpose for you? And then you respond accordingly. Now that respond accordingly is faith. You look at the evidence, you look at what he's shown, you look at what the world shows, you look at Jesus has shown, and you respond accordingly. That's faith. Not blind belief, not irrationality. Two logical, important principles. And in fact, if you look at the biblical text on which Christianity is based, these principles are all over the place. I want to focus particularly on the evidence relating to the death and resurrection of Jesus. In the New Testament accounts, they are built around these two events. They dominate the texts, both in terms of their length, the time that's spent on them, and the significance that's given to them. They are central. And when we reduce Jesus to being a supposed good teacher, a founder of religion, we've taken out the two central elements of his life and death that were emphasized completely in the New Testament writings. And let's remember, these New Testament writings were written by people to people as letters. And they were collated afterwards because they gave useful insights. And the decision about which of the letters would be included in the New Testament was very simple. Only those written by people who had direct, first-hand experience of the events. People afterwards were not considered because it was second-hand or third-hand. It's only first-hand. And if you look at every single letter, with the possible exception of one, every single one, it's crystal clear that it was first-hand experience. And the odd one, it's a balance of probability. These are the central things. What's the evidence? Put it bluntly, what evidence is there that Jesus was actually crucified and resurrected, which are central teachings of the New Testament? And then, what are the implications of it? We're back to faith. How should we respond? You look at the evidence. If you like, you look at what God's saying, what God's doing, and then you respond. Now, these are historical events, and there are vast amounts of historical records and indeed historical evidence in a wider sense relating to these two events. We're going to look at a little bit of that to see if we can get the meaning of these events, because we have to look at the evidence, the implications, and then the meaning, because it shows us how we respond, where our faith, which is a response word, an action word, should be placed. Now, the historical facts. Crucifixion was invented in the 6th century, probably somewhere in the area of the world that is roughly Iraq today. It was later employed by the Romans to terrorize the populations and impose their will. And it was always carried out by the Romans, who were the only ones who did it at the time, in a kind of standard procedure. We'll see that in a moment. And historians have looked at this. The victim was always killed. It was in fact a slow death. A fit young man crucified could last for several days. Every second was excruciating pain. They were stripped naked, so there was utter humiliation. Every body function was there for public view. And it was done in a public place because the Romans want to impose their will and to say, if you don't do what we want, this is what could happen to you. And it was only applied to men. And the historical records show absolutely clearly that's roughly the point when Jesus was crucified. This is how it was carried out. A Roman officer with 4 soldiers. The victim was nailed or tied onto some wood. The weight of the body, this wood was lifted up, and the weight of the body often caused the shoulders to dislocate, causing excruciating pain. The victim was left to hang there. Feet were tied or nailed on, and the soldiers were not allowed to leave until death. They had a rotation on guard duty the entire time. And if they didn't do it correctly, the soldiers were executed. They always did it right. Now, the crucifixion of Jesus followed that pattern. And it's recorded in numerous documents. Some are Christian, some are Jewish, and some are the secular documents of the time. Roman documents, historian documents. Now, death could be hastened by a number of things. If it was a fit young man, they could last for days. So in some ways it was better not to be fit. Sometimes the Romans did a process called scourging before the crucifixion. We've sanitized that. Jesus was in fact scourged. This involved Roman soldiers whipping the naked body, was tied to a pillar. But the whips made of leather, studded into the leather, were sharp flints and shells, bits of metal. And literally the flesh of the victim was ripped off the ribcage. Many people died from blood loss and shock simply by that brutal treatment. Death was brought about by dehydration and blood loss. So there was a lot of blood loss. Death was caused largely by dehydration. If you broke the legs of the victim, they couldn't breathe because they had to press up with their feet. And of course, if the feet were nailed on, the pain was excruciating in the feet. In the case of Jesus, to check he was dead, he was stabbed by a Roman javelin. Now that's fatal in its own right. In the end, death was a relief from this public torture. And it was usually by asphyxiation. Breathing just couldn't be carried out anymore. And often the body was left hanging there after death and was scavenged by birds and animals. And the suffering of relatives seeing their loved one tortured to death and then seeing the body just being destroyed. That was all part of the Roman psychology of terror. It's pretty awful. We've sanitized it. Now this is what history tells us. The evidence is from all over the place. It's consistent. Jesus was whipped. His body, his back was just ripped apart so that it was blood and hanging flesh. He was a fit young man, and it didn't kill him, but it weakened him enormously. The normal Roman practice was to humiliate the victim, who was made to walk to the place of execution carrying the crossbar of the cross. Jesus was so brutalized by the whipping that he collapsed during the journey, and someone had to carry it for him. At the place of execution, he was stripped naked, thrown on his back, a back that was raw right down to the ribcage, nailed to the crossbar, and the crossbar hoisted up and attached to the upright post. And then his feet were nailed to the upright post to allow him to breathe. The whole thing was designed to terrorize the population, to make conquered peoples do what the Romans wanted them to do. All of this was witnessed by some of the followers of Jesus, including his own mother. And it's worth pondering what his mother must have gone through to see her eldest son going through this. Anything that the victim possessed, the Roman soldiers could keep. It was their little reward. So the Roman soldiers got the clothes of Jesus. And they had to guard the site until death had taken place. Jesus was crucified with 2 others. They all had to die. Then they would take it in rotation on guard duty. But they had to all stay there. Jesus lasted 6 hours. During the heat of the day, unusually, he was buried. Now, rich people used to, during their lifetime, in the limestone rock of the area, chip out a cave tomb and have a huge boulder, maybe weighing tons, that would roll in front of it. Because the Jewish practice, if you were wealthy, was to be buried in such a cave. And you had these kind of family caves. Well, a rich friend of Jesus had one of these caves for himself. He gave it up. This cave had never been used before. There were no other bodies in it. And 2 men took Jesus down with the permission of the Roman authorities and put him in this cave tomb. The tomb entrance then was closed, the normal practice, but the Jewish authorities arranged for it to be sealed so that if anyone moved the stone they would know, and guards were posted day and night. Overall, from all the documents, records that exist from multiple sources, the evidence that Jesus was executed, that he died, that he was buried, is totally overwhelming. That's why it's so utterly irrational when in much of Islamic teaching it's simply asserted that he wasn't crucified. And they've come up with this absolutely amazing invention that someone took his place. I just ask, a crucifixion, stripped naked in front of your own mother, your friends, your followers, quite apart from the behavior of Jesus before and during the execution. The evidence is overwhelming. But now let's turn to the resurrection. There's a lot of documented evidence about the resurrection. But there's also evidence from other sources, some of them very critical. What we do know is this. Historical facts. The crucifixion took place on a Friday. The cave tomb was found to be empty on the Sunday morning. The seal of the tomb had been broken. The huge stone, which took many men to move, had been moved. And the guards could not explain it. Nobody had got to the tomb because the tomb had been guarded by the men throughout. So it wasn't the disciples who raided the tomb. And they couldn't find the body anywhere. Then, over a period of several weeks, people had known Jesus, some very closely, some only at a distance, in their hundreds, claimed to have met Jesus physically. Now that's just the events that are recorded. And there was a huge change. The closest followers of Jesus were hiding. They were in hiding just after the crucifixion because they thought they would be next. They were scared stiff. And yet a matter of a few weeks later, these terrified men, along with a lot of women, were out on the streets sharing news that Jesus had been resurrected with a confidence and an assurance that was completely amazing. How do we explain all that? Now, there's a lot of evidence from other records. Some are Jewish and some are secular. All of them accept that the death of Jesus took place. Again and again, they accept that the followers of Jesus believed that he'd been resurrected, even when they didn't believe it. The authorities of the day, particularly the Jewish authorities, they failed to offer any explanation for the events. It would have been easy to destroy the rumors of resurrection. Just produce the body. They couldn't. They didn't. But it is recorded again and again that they were completely amazed with the growing confidence of the followers of Jesus. What had been going on? In order to silence it all, they threatened the followers persistently, and they persecuted them, often to death. Despite that, the number of followers just kept on growing. Lots of suggestions have been put up. Let's just look at some of them. These have been analysed by those who are trained in law, as if it was in a law court. And they've come to the conclusion that none of these arguments stands any scrutiny. They don't fit the evidence. Now, there are those who say that he was put in a cool tomb, he recovered and moved the stone. Romans don't make mistakes. If your life is on the line, if you make a mistake, you don't make a mistake. And medically, those who are medically trained show that that's completely impossible. You don't survive crucifixion. And you certainly don't have the strength to move a stone. Indeed, Jesus was stabbed after, because his death was quite quick. He was stabbed with a javelin, the size of the javelin, which pierced the heart. Completely impossible. People say he wasn't placed in that particular tomb. The evidence doesn't fit it because the evidence shows his actual burial in that tomb was witnessed. It was supervised and witnessed by multiple people, many of whom were very much against Jesus. Some say the tomb wasn't secure, but the records show that the temple guards were placed on the tomb and the tomb was sealed. Just contradicts the evidence. Others say that when the tomb was found to be empty, and it was found by women to be empty, that they went to the wrong tomb. Not so, because the evidence shows that in the tomb, the grave clothes, which were recognizable as the clothes that Jesus had been buried with, the normal practice would be to wrap the body in clothes. These clothes were found in the tomb, but there's no body inside. The body had kind of evaporated, disappeared. And then this Islamic fabrication that Jesus didn't die, he was substituted by somebody else on the cross. This has been examined in detail, and logically and psychologically it's impossible, but the evidence contradicts it completely. Not only did the Romans not make a mistake, they got the right man, but he was crucified in front of his followers and his mother. These are some of the arguments that have been put up. Difficult to explain that, why people were willing to be persecuted to death if they had known that the resurrection was a hoax. You may be prepared to act for a cause that you believe in, and you see it today with suicide bombers. They're prepared to lose their lives for a cause they believe in. But people do not do that for something when they have the evidence that it's a hoax. That's very different. You don't die for what you know is not true. You may be prepared to die for something you believe is true, but you don't die for something that you know is not true. It's an interesting observation that the followers of Jesus historically have gone through endless resistance, threats and persecution. And today it's increasing. 80% of all the persecution on religious grounds in the world today is directed at the followers of Jesus. Not Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs or anybody else. It's against the followers of Jesus. And yet despite that, the numbers of people who are turning to Jesus, embracing his teaching and following him today just keeps growing. How do we explain that? This is the logic of Christianity. That God entered our human arena in the life of Jesus. Jesus taught us what life should and could be like. And he showed it was possible. But throughout his life, he confronted evil and wrongdoing wherever he met it, with enormous courage. But he didn't go around condemning people. We make a lot of messes of our lives. We mess up all the time. He didn't condemn people who'd messed up their lives. He offered release to a better way. That's very positive. And then he invited people to join him in pursuing that better way. And if you look at the teaching of the better way, if we lived that way, the world would be transformed. And that's widely agreed even by people who are very anti-religious. But he recognized that we can't do it in our own strength. We don't have the ability and the resources. He offered us the resources. Can't pursue this any further in this presentation. He offered us the resources to make it possible. Now that's the kind of claims of Jesus. Let's go back to the cross again. All sorts of understandings of the meaning of the cross have been developed over time. And many of them offer very useful insights. I'm going to offer one picture here, not suggesting it's the only one or the complete one. It assumes, and the evidence supports this, that we've made a right mess of things. And our best attempts to clean ourselves up haven't been too successful. So God came to sort things out. He came himself. And he identified with us human beings by coming in the life of a human being named Jesus. And he showed us what life could and should be. He confronted the evil in the world that's messing us up all the time. And then he was prepared to go through the worst that the evil could throw at him. The religious authorities and the secular political authorities of the day combined forces to torture him to death through excruciating pain. He was prepared to go through that because he robbed the evil of all its power. If he could go through that and come out the other side, he showed that the power is broken. He's bigger than all that evil. And on our behalf, in our place, doing what we couldn't do for ourselves, he defeated the evil, he defeated the death, and he offers us release. Release from the grip on our lives that holds us back. Release to receive his resources to take us forward. We haven't touched upon the idea of the kingdom of God. But from the very outset, Jesus invited us to come into his kingdom. To be adopted children of God, accepted by God, empowered to live for God. And that invitation has gone out ever since, and billions have responded to it. It fits the facts. It fits the evidence. And I'm not suggesting it's the whole picture or the only way of looking at it. The theories about what happened on the cross, in terms of its meaning, in some ways it's secondary. More important is the fact that it did happen and that God did something amazing for you and me. I mentioned the kingdom of God. It's a spiritual world where God rules. In other words, we enter the kingdom when we say, I want to live God's way. I've messed up, I want a better way. And God accepts us in and empowers us. And God entered the human arena in Jesus, and he invited us into that kingdom. We're adopted as his children. We could find fulfillment in life, the fulfillment that we so often miss, the fulfillment that God has for us, by our choice, not imposed, not by a rule book, not by trying to impress him. We can't impress the God of glory, but by responding to him. That's the logic of Christianity. We focused on the way of Jesus. What have other religions to offer? We'll look at that next.